حنبلش إن شاء الله على خير. Okay, Dana, Clayton, you can start now.
Okay, thank you, Salam. Welcome back, everyone, on the second part of our training session. We can start by a recap of what we did yesterday. Today, we want to at least improve on our interaction so that we really need to move towards a participatory approach of training delivery and reduce this one-way delivery system. I'm also learning in the process. So I'm requesting each and every one of us here online to give us at least a recap of what you managed to assimilate yesterday, what you learned from yesterday's presentation. So briefly, say in half a minute, let's have each and every one of us here presenting what we learned yesterday. So we can go by alphabetical order. We start with Basel, then Cairo, then Osman, then Shelan, and Shahada. Forgive me, yeah, we go that way. So over to you, Basel.
Just a view of what they...
Yeah, just a recap of what you learned yesterday.
اوكي كليتن بده ايانا نعمل بس هيك مراجعه سريعه ايش غطينا امبارح، اذا حدا بيقدر يعطينا هيك بريف انه ايش غطينا امبارح، بس 1 point or 2 points من ايش غطيناهم امبارح. كمان مره بنقدر نحكي بالعربي، ما في مشكله، انا موجوده. واذا حابين تكون مشاركتكم بالعربي كمان ما في مشكله. وهو حابب ان كل شخص يشارك يعني انه يشارك بالمراجعه.
I could see your hand is up, Vivian. Can you share whatever you want to share with us? Vian?
Yes, yesterday we talked about the plants, the best conditions to be growing the plants. What are the conditions that are needed to be having good plants and good growing for them, as soil, light, good seeds, and how to be improving that.
Okay, thank you, Vian. Then. Yes, as we go through this, we will try to avoid repeating what would have been said. So the earlier the better. Over to you, Basel. You can present either in Arabic or English. مشكلة ما في.
طيب طلال كان عندك إشي تحكيه؟ طلال has his mic on.
Also, we talked about the principles of sustainable agriculture. We have 5 principles.
Okay, sure. Thank you. It's quite impressive. It's quite impressive that people were listening and they are actually assimilating what we shared. Who else can also give us a recap of what we learned yesterday? We would expect each and every participant to give us at least one phrase or so.
Not everyone. إذا حابين كمان تقدروا تكتبوا بالchat box إذا مش حابين تحكوا كمان بالهذا. إذا اللي مش مرتاح يحكي بقدر يكتب بالchat box.
Okay, no problem. I think we can proceed. So today's session is just a continuation of yesterday. We are still focusing on the We are still focusing on the sustainable, the concept of sustainable agriculture. And we are now at a stage where we were actually discussing or presenting on the impact of the Syrian crisis on sustainable agriculture. Remember, we said the Syrian crisis is actually negatively impacting on the crop production, right? It is also impacting on livestock production. We discussed all those aspects yesterday. And it is also important for the trainees to realize that the Syrian crisis is even also impacting on the natural resource base. The natural resource base, which is very vital and important for pro-resilient sustainable agricultural production. So the crisis is not just affecting the farmers and their crop production. The crisis is not just affecting the farmers and their livestock production. The crisis is also even negatively impacting or affecting the natural resource base, which will have a triple effect of disrupting sustainable agriculture. So now let's look at what are the aspects of the natural resource base which are actually being negatively affected by the Syrian crisis. Okay, so in this case, now let's look at the rapid depletion of forests, rangelands. Rangelands here we are referring to this land use patterns mainly serving for grazing livestock. That's what we refer to as rangelands, right? There is also depletion of soils, water, and other natural sources. How? Due to the prolonged drought, of course, affecting the agricultural production system. But how is it happening now? Because you would find that depletion of forest, rangelands, soils, or water systems, and other natural resources due to prolonged drought. Say you are all aware that in 2006, 2009, 2014, 2018, and even currently, there are drought scenarios which are actually the Syrians are experiencing. But this is drought. So how is the crisis exacerbating or worsening the situation? The crisis is bringing about displacement of people. And these people also moves with their animals into host communities. And these same host communities would be having their own population. So there's this additional or localized population increase due to IDP movements as well as refugees because of the crisis. And this now causes a situation of overpopulation. We call it a localized overpopulation within a locality to such an extent that it can accelerate the degradation of these rangelands. Think of, say, people moving from one particular area with their animals. They get into a host community with their animals. Then adding now these numbers of animals, there are tendencies of having high populations of both livestock and people, thereby causing actually the accelerated degradation of rangelands due to, say, overgrazing. Also, it could be a situation of water resources being disturbed as well. We talked yesterday about stream bank cultivation and so forth. Then again, because of the crisis, let's not just focus on the Syrian crisis per se, but we can also focus on the regional crisis. One trainee yesterday shared with us the impact of the Euphrates River basin, where some other governance system within the upstream of that Euphrates river basin, they are actually causing this blockage or serious impoundments where they actually limit the downflow of water downstream, thereby negatively impacting the Syrian people who also rely upon the same river system in terms of irrigation. This is all emanating from the crisis. If they would be good coexistence, peaceful coexistence, of course, this could actually lead to regional equitable sharing of these water resources and thereby contributing towards sustainable agriculture. So with the crisis itself, it also brings in poor governance, bad relations between even regional entities in terms of governance. And there's also a need for good governance of water resources to ensure that these resources are equitably shared and enable communities to perpetuate the sustainable agricultural practices. And another effect which could be contributed by the Syrian crisis, you think of wildfires burning. These wildfires, they reduce biodiversity, they reduce the forest cover, which is also very important for as habitats for pollination agents. And with this wildfire burning, it also causes reduction in terms of forage cover, thereby leading to rangeland degradation. It can also affect livestock production, thereby it becomes detrimental to sustainable agriculture. And again, with wildfires, there's a tendency to cause what we call hard pan of arable land. And we remember we also mentioned some aspects of destruction of the soil ecosystem when it comes to wildfires, burning the biotic living organisms within the soil system, which are very important when it comes to biodegradation of organic matter, which needs to be turned into available nutrients for our much loved crops. And how is the Syrian crisis contributing to the wildfires? We would find that opposing forces might intentionally burn some crops, and even without the aspect of intention burning, we would find that crossfire is the warfare, as mortars actually launches all these weapons of war. It's all about fire. So in the process, we would have the wilderness actually being burnt out of the crossfire, as opposing forces would be fighting in these wars, right? So we move on to the next slide. We already touched on the unfair practices of our upstream river impoundments on the Euphrates River basin between Turkey and northeast Syria. So again, the Syrian crisis was also affecting sustainable agriculture through disrupting the agricultural supply, market chains, and trade. Remember, Dana introduced the importance of market system development approach in designing agricultural projects. And remember again, if you recall very well, the key 5 principles of sustainable agriculture. The very first one is emphasizing on increasing productivity, profitability of agricultural production. So in that regards, there's no way you can talk about increasing productivity and profitability without focusing on the supply chain management as well as value chain development of the agricultural sector. So again, as the Syrian crisis is disrupting this very vital component of the agricultural sector, it is also detrimentally affecting progress or attempts towards sustainable agriculture. So you would find that generally producers and transporters, producers, these are farmers, and even traders, they tend to face extremely high transaction costs and security risk. How? Because sometimes they need to even import agricultural inputs, which could have been locally available. It did not be the case of the crisis. Okay, then and again you'd find that the presence of many military checkpoints along the road network system between farms and markets often cause a very lengthy searches at these checkpoints, and sometimes resulting in serious charges where producers, farmers, and consumers are actually forced to pay extra tax outside the normal tax system, where transporters are actually forced to pay these taxes on checkpoints. And again, this is detrimental. How? Because already to be actually contributing to more crop production costs, and thereby reducing the profitability of any system. And again, you find that within the agricultural production, we also have this component of horticultural produce, which is fragile. It is also perishable. So the moment a route becomes so lengthy in terms of blockages due to so many checkpoints, it can also negatively affect the quality of horticultural produce, as they may take a lengthy period to get to their destined destination for sale. This can actually also affect the shelf life of horticultural produce, as well as it will also have a negative impact towards the pricing itself. So again, in that process, farmers tend to increase the wastage of high value and nutritious, especially these perishable vegetables or even dairy produce in the process. But you would find that without a crisis in a particular country or a community, produce and products, both inputs as well as output for the agricultural system, could easily flow and actually contribute well towards the viability of any agricultural production system. So you would find that again, the Syrian crisis, other than directly affecting crop production per se, other than directly affecting livestock production per se, other than directly affecting the natural resource base, it is also negatively affecting the market system development as far as the sustainable agricultural production is concerned. Why are we teaching you this? This is very important, so that even as you also design these projects, you need to get to understand such challenges on which farmers are bound to incur, so that even as we design to support farmers, you also need to understand that they tend to also face this lengthy transportation as well as high costs in terms of transporting both their inputs and their produce. So, for example, if you are a project manager, maybe for vegetable production, knowing that the Syrian crisis on its own is also negatively impacting on the agricultural supply routes, both for inputs and outputs. Sometimes even within your mix of, say, vegetable seeds for farmers, you may also need to consider including those vegetable produce which farmers could also, upon harvest, they can also take what we call post-harvest processing or post-harvest handling techniques to improve crop or produce shelf life, without them having to always force their produce into the market upon harvesting. I can give you a typical example to say, maybe you are supporting farmers who are producing vegetables, like say tomatoes, leaf vegetables, and so forth. They might be also need, as informed by need assessments, of course, or market assessments, of course. You may also need to start thinking of including crop seeds like, say, garlic, if this is a high value crop, say onion, and so forth. So that by the end of the day, upon your farmer trainings, you could also include trainings towards post-harvest handling techniques, which may even involve farmers to, say, solar dry their onions, solar dry their garlics, in such a way that if the environment is not conducive for them to transport their produce, they can even keep it after solar drying this particular produce. Because if you just support farmers with all produce, which can easily get perishable, all right? Think of, say, tomatoes. Farmers might not be in a position to process tomatoes into tinned tomato and so forth. So upon harvesting, they may even need to force this produce into the market. In failure to get buyers, the produce might even rot due to glut. You might think of that one. But if you have this mixture of perishable and other vegetable produce, which could be treated upon harvesting to improve shelf life, then you could actually cushion the farmers against losses in terms of post-harvest losses and the wastages. That is to say, it's so easy for farmers to store their garlic, to store their onion. This is just a typical example after processing upon harvesting, so that they can actually take that produce anytime when the market becomes viable, or when the system or the environment becomes viable for them to actually take the produce back onto the market. And sometimes this is also helpful because farmers can capitalize on what we call placing their produce during periods of scarcity, right? As informed by community need assessments or market assessment, you can identify those periods where a particular produce is actually scarce within a community. And then, because farmers would have actually processed their produce and store their produce in their granaries, and then they can actually retrieve that produce during period of scarcity. And definitely during period of the produce scarcity, the demand will be generally high, because naturally that particular produce will be scarce during that period. Then definitely because of scarcity, the demand is high, then obviously the price would also be high for that particular produce. Then we go on again, still on the effect of the crisis impacting negatively on the agricultural supply and market chain. You would also find that because of the crisis, it is obvious that so many marketplaces have been repeatedly destroyed, and some even become too dangerous to operate and have been repeatedly re-established elsewhere. So again, as you also design your projects, you also need to address this issue of market infrastructure distraction. That's why some of the projects also needs to include to include the market infrastructure rehabilitation as part of project designs. So again, you would find that the crisis itself, remember, for sustainable agriculture to persist or to be effective, it also centers on profitability. But however, for farmers to be profitable, there should be consumers who are able to also buy or purchase or the outputs, the product themselves, right? So we would find that the Syrian crisis, again, per se, it is also affecting household purchasing powers, the ability of household to be able even to buy the agricultural produce. So the crisis is also causing high employment level across the communities. Also, casual labor markets are also really being affected by the crisis itself. All these aspects will also lead to disruption of efforts towards ensuring sustainable agriculture across the communities. So the main challenge now towards the effort to increase the productivity of agriculture in a sustainable manner. Generally, we, as of yesterday, I think as part of the discussion yesterday, we centered more on the aspect that generally there is a tendency for farmers and stakeholders, and sometimes even humanitarian partners, to focus more on increasing agricultural productivity alone. That is profit making at the farm level. That's the focus of many households as well as many stakeholders, without or maybe at the expense of or ignoring the need to have a holistic agroecological integration of natural resource management with the food and the nutritional security. So we are simply saying we are overemphasizing here the need to desist from just focusing on profit making at farm level without also taking care of the surrounding natural resources for sustainable agricultural development in any particular community. So now let's come closer home. You would find that the major impacts within the Syrian farmers and northeast Syria included. There's serious reduction in terms of crop production and the productivity. Already we noted that there's a 10 to 20% reduction in crop yields due to both climate change as well as the Syrian crisis itself. So we do have some records indicating that, for example, if you think of crop yield for wheat, before the crisis, on average, irrigated wheat used to actually, farmers used to attain 4 to 6 tons per hectare. But as far as the current records from the FAO WFP consolidated crop and crop monitoring, crop and food security monitoring reports, we have noted that on average it has since reduced all the way from 4 to 6 tons per hectare. Irrigated wheat at present, it is actually around 2.5 tons per hectare, mainly because of climate change as well as the crisis, which has caused cessation of subsidies from the government. Yes, the humanitarian partners managed to fill that gap, but not to the same level or to the same extent on which farmers used to get support from the government prior to the crisis. Also, even animal production and its productivity has since reduced all the way to like 12% reduction. Then there is also increased pest and disease incidence due to climate change. Definitely, we would find that pests and diseases tends to become resistant over time. So there is now there's actually lack of continuous scientific research to move in pace with the changing climate as well as the changing pest and disease incidents. Then there's no need for us to continue emphasizing on the water scarcity due to climate change as well as due to some political issues in relation to impoundments over the Euphrates river system. I think I can pause here for some questions if we do have some questions. Then if not, maybe we can have a break, a 15 minutes break, and then we'll proceed.
في حدا عنده أي سؤال، أي استفسار، أي تعقيب، في إشي مش واضح؟ يا جماعة ما تستحوا عادي، أي وقت حابين تدخلوا أو تسألوا سؤال anytime، بالعربي بالإنجليزي بأي لغة بدكم إياها.
Okay, so we can break for now. We meet again after 15 minutes, Salah.
Okay, thank you, Clayton and Dana. أهلين شكرية، يا هلا. مش مشكلة، إحنا أوريدي بلشنا، وهينا عم ناخد هلأ بريك إن شاء الله، وحنرجع كمان تقريبا 10 دقائق، وممكن ترجع للفيديو للي راح عليك من قبل. أهلا وسهلا شكرية.
Thank you صلاح. I'm sorry.
شكرية، هلأ في بريك، بلشنا إحنا 10:03 وهلأ ماخدين بريك.
Hello, Salah. I think we can resume, right?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Welcome back to the second part of the session. So here we want to look at the factors which actually drive sustainable agriculture. What are the critical factors which actually drives sustainable agriculture? First and foremost, sustainable agriculture is driven by the institutional values, which tends to provide a framework towards governance of the available natural resources, which are very critical to sustainable agriculture. You would find that sustainable agriculture is a function of the following factors. First and foremost, we talked a lot about the economic viability of the enterprise, the profitability of the farms. This normally drives the system, regardless of its size, whether you are talking of large-scale farms, small-scale farms, low-input gardens, as long as its economic viability is sounding, as long as people are making a profit, then people are ready also to take care of the surrounding, to take care of the environment. People will be in a position to participate towards environmental protection. Be it at individual farms or be it at large-scale farms and so forth. But you would find that it is also very important as we design projects for sustainable agriculture to be inclusive in regards to its political desirability, because you would find that most of the natural resources as assets, they are under the control and ownership of the local authority, the governing systems, when it comes to ownership and control. What are we saying is that you would find that rivers and streams, underground waters, and so forth, these are under the custodian of the local authority, the governing system. So, so many times we tend to design projects solely focusing on farmers and maybe a few stakeholders without actually involving or including the local authority as an active stakeholder in terms of project implementation. This is very important and vital, because you would also want these relevant stakeholders to play their role when it comes to management and governance of these very important natural resources, which are very, very important towards supporting or ensuring sustainable agriculture production. And then when it comes to the physical resource, let's say the land itself, you would find that as we are going to proceed, we'll talk more in relation to land management. This can be manipulated at household level, at farmer level, whereas at a higher level, you would need that political muscle to ensure that the rules and regulations are set when it comes to managing the locally available natural resources, be it water resources, land as a resource, or also forests as a resource. So you find that sustainable agriculture is actually a dynamic process. It's not linear, it's complex, and but however, at any stage, at any particular phase of its development, that is to say, any stage of sustainable agricultural development is very vital and important. And it is also very important for us to appreciate that the pace of progress towards sustainable agriculture is also influenced by the status quo. What we mean here is that whatever the current scenario a particular set of farmers are experiencing in a particular locality, the progress towards sustainable agriculture is actually influenced by that status quo. In other sense, or in other words, we are saying the environmental integrity of a particular system and how people are accepting that environmental ecosystem actually also influence the pace and the rate of progress towards any development of a sustainable agricultural practice. And we would also need to appreciate that any system tends to be flexible in regards to responses which are related to environmental disruption, such as soil erosion, extreme weather events, as well as maybe fluctuating world markets. So you really need to do what we call context-specific analysis to get to understand the local environment, starting all the way from mapping the available natural resources per se. What is their current state? What is the current state of, say, water resources? What is the current state of water resources and land resources in relation to soil erosion and siltation, right? So maybe as a baseline benchmark, you can now start from there and say, okay, if we start to incorporate some sustainable agricultural practices, for instance, like contour planting into the system, for instance, rules and regulations to avoid or reduce stream and cultivation, to what extent can we actually reduce the degradation or desertification processes which would be actually happening in any particular locality or community? So, for instance, after getting to know the status quo within a particular area, say, for example, you are in Amuda, you, after doing your mapping, getting to understand the natural resources, where are the water resources, where are the rivers, where are the streams, what is the status quo in regards to the water table and underground water, and so forth. By the end of the day, you also need now to say what, out of a cocktail of elements of sustainable agriculture, what are the ideal elements for adoption to ensure that you promote sustainable agriculture in a particular area. So first and foremost, what is important is to start maybe with this context analysis. Context analysis in the form of getting to know your ecosystem, your natural ecosystem. You also need to do what we call geographical ecosystem mapping, profiling, so that you get to understand the challenge. Remember, earlier we discussed or we touched a lot on the negative impacts driven by the crisis, driven by climate change, and so forth. So, having known all these sorts of challenges and the resultant degraded aspect of the ecosystem, you now also need to actually start selecting out of a list of elements of sustainable agriculture to say what aspects of these elements do we really need to adopt in a particular area so that we can address the pre-identified challenges to ensure sustainable agriculture. For example, maybe you are in a particular area like, say, Amuda or or Reslain there. Maybe after doing your mapping, you identify that maybe yellow rust as a disease is actually a problem when it comes to wheat and barley production. Maybe you would find that red spider mite is becoming a problematic pest when it comes to tomato production in a particular area. Definitely, as pests and diseases affect crop production or affect livestock production, they also actually reduce or negatively affect the profitability. And remember, without the profitability aspect of agricultural production, then it's not easy for farmers to actually practice sustainable agriculture. Then, in such a scenario, you also need now to support farmers towards an integrated pest and disease management, which is a sustainable approach when it comes to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way to minimize economic, health, and environmental risk. What we mean by integrated pest and disease management, this is the situation where you also need to consider that, okay, in short, you really need to control pests and disease in an environmental friendly manner. We all know that the chemicals, naturally, they are dangerous to the environment. They are dangerous to people, they are dangerous to insects. They tend to kill all the pests as well as much loved insects. Think of the pollination agents, like we said before. So before a farmer or before farmers are trained to apply chemical pesticides to their crops, they also need to be taught when it comes to the aspect of first trying all those environmental friendly techniques when it comes to pest and disease management. For example, we find that they can also use, say, cultural control methods of pest and disease. We find that farmers can also practice what we call crop rotation in a way to break the pest and disease cycle incidents. And in that process, farmers can reduce the use of chemicals, which can actually negatively affect the environment. But here, what we are trying to emphasize here is the aspect, is the point that just think of yourself as a person. You would find that before you even go for chemical medications, normally we tend to start by even ignoring if you are not feeling well, hoping that maybe your natural immune system can actually fight the disease and you can recover. If that is the case, that's fine. So even there are some people who, at first instance, when they feel that they are not well, they quickly get onto medication, then they consume chemicals. And definitely every chemical has got some side effects. But it is advisable sometimes to say, okay, if you are not feeling well, and if you think that maybe your natural immune system can manage this, sometimes it's advisable to avoid a chemical medication up until maybe the pain persists or the problem persists, then you can go for chemical medications. And sometimes before we even pounce on chemical medication, there's a tendency to try the biological control system where we use natural products. Remember, at the advent of COVID-19, people started consuming a lot, the likes of ginger, the likes of garlic, lemon products, trying to fight the virus. up and until we are now at a stage people are now using vaccination. So this is the same case with the farmers. Chemical use should be the last resort, but wherever possible, if there is an opportunity to use biological control as well as cultural control, and sometimes even physical control of pests and disease, you would find that in a small input garden, some experienced farmers could actually apply what we call physical control measures of pests by even physically picking them out. Or you can also think of people who could actually scare away quillia birds from their sorghum crop. You see, it's another way of managing pests. Birds could be also a pest to a particular farm, but instead of applying chemical sprays to kill the birds, you can actually also scare them away, even using some automated sirens to chase the quillia birds from the farms. This is also common in some developed countries where you could use siren system, automated siren system, which could actually detect, say, quillia birds within wheat farms, large wheat farms, and then with that sound noise from a siren system can actually scare away the birds. In that process, you can even avoid the dangerous chemicals which are not environmental already under livestock production. If you happen to say during your mapping within your locality, you realize that there's a tendency of overgrazing, and overgrazing normally leads to bare land, and with the bare land, soils are exposed to rainfall impact, which can also actually cause soil erosion. Then you can actually adopt what we call rotational grazing within communal lands. And that's why we always emphasize the need to have local authorities as part and parcel of stakeholders. Why? Because some of these grazing lands are actually a common resource property on which their governance can actually be managed better at the local authority level to actually effect this rotational grazing system. Then again, in scenarios where you experience soil erosion, for instance, say on steep lands and so forth, you can actually advise farmers to practice soil conservation techniques, which could be in a form of strip cropping, that is planting across the slope as opposed from planting along the slope, which can aid soil erosion. And again, you can also advise farmers towards reduced tillage or zero tillage where possible, depending on what type of crops are they actually producing. Then sometimes you can also reduce soil loss by encouraging farmers to also do have what we call windbreaks. This could be in the form of live fences across farms or across low input gardens. Then some other elements to be considered when you are advising farmers to address challenges in regards to sustainable agriculture. It could also send towards water quality and wetlands conservation. So it is also important to conserve water as well as to protect wetlands, since water is actually the backbone of any agricultural system, be it crops and livestock production. So, of course, you really need to protect the wetlands because wetlands are the source of water discharges into rivers and streams. Also, wetlands plays a key role or an important ecosystem service when it comes to filtering nutrients as well as pesticides, as well as providing wildlife habitat for the much loved pollination agencies. And then again, you can also advise the livestock farmers to also grow plants such as rye, clover, veg in the off seasons after harvesting, instead of laying their farms or land fallow. They can also produce these drought tolerant but livestock required plants, which could also serve as a substitute for livestock feed during off season. And also the good part of such crop types is that they can also serve as they can also serve the very important role of combating soil erosion during the off seasons. But of course, this is only ideal in areas where lands are made to lie fallow during certain seasons. But you find that sometimes in northeast Syria, come winter, people produce winter crops. Come summer, people produce summer crops without actually letting the land lie fallow. Okay, so you would find that another way to ensure that farmers could be also progress towards sustainable agriculture, we really need to diversify in terms of our agricultural productivity. Diversity, what we mean by diversity, this is an aspect of growing a greater variety of crops on a farm, or the aspect of producing a greater variety of livestock types on a farm. This can also help reduce risk in the form of some extreme weather events or even some market challenges. Remember, I gave you that example where you really need to have a mix of crops. Say for a vegetable farmer, you might also need to have a mix of perishable, high-value perishable crops, as well as those other vegetable produce, which could actually undergo a post-harvest processing to improve shelf life so that they can be offloaded onto the market during the market window period of scarcity. So all these aspects is an attempt to ensure profitability, right? If you diversify your crops, if you diversify your sorry for that disruption. If you diversify your crops or even diversify your livestock types when it comes to agricultural production, definitely farmers are cushioned against losses, because if one type of crop or if one type of livestock is affected, say maybe by diseases or maybe by natural disasters, then there's an opportunity for farmers to benefit from another crop type which could have been spared, or they could be also a benefit for a particular farmer to benefit from another livestock type which might have been spared by a particular natural disaster. Think of, say, this is very general and obvious to say, if one livestock farmer is actually rearing, say, a poultry, goats, sheep, and sorry, my laptop is running out of power. So, say you have one type of livestock. Say one farmer is actually producing sheep, and another farmer is got actually a diversified livestock type farm production where you do have poultry, goats, sheep, maybe even donkeys and so forth. If there happens to be a disease affecting, say, sheep, it might wipe all the sheep, but at the same time, this farmer can continue to benefit from the other remaining livestock units, as opposed from one farmer who might be actually only producing, say, sheep. If there happens to be a pest and a disease outbreak affecting sheep, it means the whole agribusiness is affected, and definitely the profitability is affected. So as we support farmers, we also need to encourage them to diversify when it comes to agricultural production. Then again, there's also an element of nutrient management. We would find that farmers generally incur lots of costs in an attempt to buy chemical fertilizers to enrich soil fertility or to enrich nutrient content within their landscape or farms. But at the same time, you would need that it is also important to train farmers in regards to use of manure, compost, as well as the inclusion of leguminous cover crops as part of crop rotation to reduce the cost of fertilizers. Another important element is on agroforestry. You will find that by nature, the fact that Syria is a desert-like vegetation type or semi-arid climate system, and there is also a need to support farmers where possible or where necessary towards agroforestry. Agroforestry, this is a situation where farmers actually produce both crops, livestock, as well as plantation trees. And these plantation trees could be in the form of fruits, or it could be in the form of trees meant to supply fiber. Remember, papers are made from trees, so sometimes in other scenarios, farmers can actually produce eucalyptus trees for resale, so that the timber industry can also benefit from the agricultural system. Why advocating for agroforestry? Again, this is another form of diversification of agricultural production, and also agroforestry can also include crops being produced simultaneously with the plantation trees, which could be in the form of olive trees in Syria. It could be also in the form of grapefruit. It can be also be in the form of anyway, maybe I need also to pose a question here to say, what are the common plantation trees in Syria which are compatible with the crop production in any setup? You would find that some farmers, when it comes to olive tree plantation, they can also have some olive mature trees plantations being managed at the same time with small livestock production, where in between the trees, some farmers can actually plant those livestock fodder crops so that the small livestock can also feed from there. Can you also give us some typical examples of some plantation trees which are common in Syria and are compatible with the crop production or small livestock production?
كليتن هون عم بيسأل إذا حدا بيقدر يعطينا أمثلة على أشجار تنزرع بسوريا compatible livestock production والcrops، يعني أشجار مثمرة يعني بمعنى آخر. في حدا يقدر يعطينا أمثلة؟ Can you check the chat box? إذا yellow corn طلال السعين. Yellow corn.
Oh, okay. Yellow corn. Can you explain this a bit?
تقدر تشرح لنا شوي هاي طلال إيش قصدك؟
Oh, yellow.
The yellow corn maize. It is used for feed livestock as fodder. Also, we can use it as fodder for livestock and all animals, chicken or. Also, we can use it as crops. The farmers usually plant these crops because it is strategic crops in Raqqa.
Yes, Tala, that's very correct. So you would find that this is a very typical example for livestock feed crop or a livestock fodder crop, the yellow corn. I know we also have white corn, that's maize, and this is also compatible. You can actually have, say, you do have under agroforestry. We are discussing under agroforestry. For instance, you do have maybe a plantation of olive tree. Then in between the rows, as part of intercropping, you can actually produce the yellow corns now, so that at some point when they attain a particular stage of crop growth, then you can set your livestock into these plantations where the plantations would be intercropped with this maize, yellow maize or yellow corn. Then the animals could actually start harvesting or feeding on the yellow maize. And again, this is another aspect of diversification when it comes to agricultural production, because within a plantation, you are, say, for example, producing olive. Then at the same time, within that plantation, you are actually also using it as a pasture for your grazing livestock, which could actually also feed on the yellow corn, which you would have produced in that same particular land. Thank you very much, Tala, for such a good practical example.
في حد تاني عنده example تاني غير الذرة الصفراء؟ example على أشجار أو نباتات تزرع يمكن تستخدمها كأعلاف وبنفس الوقت هي أشجار مثمرة. I'm just asking if anyone has another example.
Okay. Anyway, so silence means we are contented so far. So the other aspect, the ninth one, is on marketing elements of sustainable agriculture. You would find that as we design projects, we really need to ensure that farmers make profits. Farming is taken as a business. We call it farming as a business. So farmers need to be capacitated through farmer training in regards to market linkages, as well as that's why even Dana is preparing you guys with even a standalone training in regards to market system development approaches in line with programming. Why? Because by the end of the day, farming is a business. So farmers need to also make profit so that they can also take care of the environment for the sake of the present generation, while also taking care of the needs of the future generations. So what we mean here, there is need to ensure that as we support farmers, we really need to train farmers or to make farmer awareness sessions where farmers need to be made aware that they need to produce crops which are earmarked for a market. Yes, we do know that sometimes farmers actually produce mainly for home consumption, but definitely there is also a need to ensure that farmers produce for both home consumption as well as sale of surplus produce. But again, for the sale of surplus produce, farmers need not to produce, then upon harvesting, then they start looking for a market. If they do such a practice, it would mean that if the produce is a perishable produce, they will end up trying to force a produce into the market. And if that produce fails to get buyers, then farmers will compromise and try even to reduce the price of their produce in order to get their produce bought. You see, this should not be the scenario. Good planning when it comes to sustainable agricultural production is that farmers needed to find or to secure markets well before they even start planting any crop. That is to say, a good farmer should know where and how is he planning to sell his or her produce well before even planting the seeds themselves. So, but you find that the conventional way is always the practice of saying, okay, let's plant. We'll see it upon harvesting where we can take our produce. If you plant that way, chances are very high to end up even selling your produce at compromised price, because traders can also exploit farmers if farmers become so desperate sometimes to such an extent that they cannot keep most. This is very common in regards to horticultural or vegetable produce, which are perishable. This is very common where farmers would end up being exploited by traders, because traders would know that farmers sometimes they might not have some storage facilities like cold storage facilities to actually keep the perishable produce. So they will end up become desperate and just sell for the sake of selling even at lower prices. So as we support farmers, let's ensure that we train them around market linkages. We train them around market search so that they are in a position to actually plan and design their cropping calendar to ensure that they produce agricultural produce for an earmarked market. I think after this, so what needs to be done by the end of the day? I think we have talked a lot about the negative impact and so forth. But in the scenario of Northeast Syria, what needs to be done to ensure that the agricultural production is actually practiced in a sustainable way, and as well as what needs to be done for humanitarian partners to ensure that agricultural projects are designed to promote sustainable agriculture. I think first and foremost, we really need to understand that sustainability of agriculture is a process. It's not an event. It's not a once-off thing. It's actually a process, an evolving process. So as a process, you really need to understand the status quo first, then get to understand at what level of sustainable agriculture a particular community is regarding or as defined by the locally available natural resources. Then from there now, you would need to develop some, or you really need to actually support farmers towards some technical support. You also need to contribute towards the policy environment, to say there is also need sometimes to ensure that policies environment or policies are enacted to create a conducive environment which is supportive towards sustainable agriculture. And, again, policy there is related or is linked to the governance system when it comes to rules and regulation towards the locally available natural resources. Then above all now, we will also need to finance farmers themselves. So you would find that there is a tendency to just finance agricultural production. We normally call it a piecemeal approach, where humanitarian partners simply come with a little bit of working capital in the form of input seeds distribution, the common one, right? And sometimes maybe cash for inputs, so that farmers can buy agricultural inputs and start producing, without including these other holistic aspects, the policy, the governance. Yes, technically normally is covered, because farmers sometimes are even trained on how to improve agricultural production practices and so forth. But there is also a tendency to forget training farmers in regards to natural resource management, you see. So we need to approach this in a holistic manner, so that we don't leave one aspect behind and just focus on the financial support of farmers, say with inputs and farmer training on increasing agricultural productivity, without also including the aspect of farmer support in relation to how best they should manage their natural resources, and also even contribute towards climate smart climate change mitigation measures and even adaptation measures. So this is what needs to be done. There's need for continuous research and innovations in sustainable agriculture. You really need to take agriculture as an integrated system. There you could see there's agroecology there. That is to say, there's need for humanitarian partners and farmers to appreciate that agriculture, that is crops and livestock production, is not a standalone entity. It needs to be linked to ecology. By definition, ecology there refers to the interdependence of living organisms, kalas. So we are simply saying there's this need to link agriculture, crops and livestock production needs to be linked to the ecological system of any environment. There we call it the agroecology. Right? Then out of that agroecology, yes, we now do have some improved integrated crop and livestock management. Right? This is where farmers and humanitarian partners tend to focus more crops and livestock management. But sometimes we forget the need to also focus on the improved biodiversity for pest management, because the same pests are destructive to the crops. The same pests sometimes are problematic to the soil and so forth. You see, so and again, there's also a need to ensure that we also emphasize farmer support in relation to the markets. So this table is actually presenting all what needs to be done in one chart. All what needs to be done in one chart. We need to link agriculture to the ecosystem. That's what we call agroecology, right? Linked to the environment there, the surrounding. But how do we link that? Yes, let's not just focus on improving integrated crop and livestock management, but in the process, let's ensure that soil management is catered for. Let's ensure that improved biodiversity conservation is also catered for. Then in that process, you would find that we would have addressed some social capital there. That is the improvement of our ecological health, as well as the empowerment of rural communities. Has also contributed by value chain development, the economics part of it, the profitability of all these systems. But again, we would find that there is need for continuous research and innovations to why research? Research is vital and important so that you identify some gaps. This will not be like one size fits all, because you find that in one particular area, maybe pests are actually a limiting factor of sustainable agriculture. Out of research, then you may be able to identify the main challenges, the limiting factors. Then out of research, if you identify that the limiting factor of sustainable agriculture is pest problems or high pest incidents, then you need to now address that particular aspect. Then in other particular locality, you might, through research, you might identify that maybe pest and soil erosion are a problem. Then out of those findings, you now also need to coin your responses, or you might also need to design your projects to address the problem of pest and soil issues. I think I can break now again for 15 minutes. Then we'll come back to the last part of today's session. This is all about the concepts of sustainable agriculture. In our next session, we'll now tone it down towards how we really need to implement our agricultural production projects within the context-specific scenario of Northeast Syria. So, Salah, I think we can break for 15 minutes again. We aim to complete our session again before 2 p.m.
اوكي طيب ثانك يو كلايتن. اوكي بريك الى ال 12:03 ان شاء الله، ربع ساعه 15 دقيقه وبنرجع. يا جماعه حاولوا ترجعوا على الوقت مشان ما نتاخر، لانه على 12:03 حنبلش على طول. فما حنضل نستنى ونحكي يلا وينكم يلا وينكم، فبليز حاولوا ارجعوا على الوقت مشان نخلص كمان على الوقت. الله يسعدكم يا رب، يعطيكم الف عافيه.
Okay, Salah, can we resume?
Yes, please start when you are ready.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to the last session of our training. So the main question is, what needs to be done? Yes, I think ever since we started the session yesterday, we have been wailing, discussing about the problems, where are they coming from, many problems, natural problems, natural problems, for example, in the form of climate change impact, man-made, the crisis itself, and how is it impacting on sustainable agriculture. So, yes, this was part and parcel of the introduction part of it for us to understand the challenges and what is it all about, this big animal called sustainable agriculture. But by the end of the day, the main question is, so what needs to be done so that we ensure the sustainability of agricultural production, say in northeast Syria, or even anywhere in the world? There are four main key areas. There are four main key areas. You would find that we really need to activate the pro-resilience agenda in food security and the agricultural sector. We really need to activate the pro-resilience agenda. What do we mean by activating a pro-resilience agenda is to say whatever we are doing now to support farmers, it needs to be a pro-resilience action. It needs to be an action which focuses on addressing the immediate needs, while at the same time it is also addressing the needs of the future generation, the sustainability. And remember that sustainable livelihood framework where we mentioned about linking relief, recovery, and development, the LRRD approach. That is to say, in as much as you are addressing, say, emergency livelihood support, you also need to ensure that farmers are supported in a way to ensure that they produce crops today and they will be in a position to continuously or subsequently produce crops or livestock with less external support in the long run. So there is need now to ensure that as we design projects, we encompass this strategic partnership and direct our actions towards the four key areas. That is to say, like crops, livestock, rangelands, and the natural resources, both at local level as well as at regional level, all the way to the national level. How can we do so? We need to ensure that we manage the risk and the crisis. Yes, we are in a crisis, but we also need to manage it. We also need to manage the risks which are associated with the sustainable agriculture production. How do we, or how do communities need to address or to manage such risk? There is need to implement institutional systems, or also to ensure that regulatory frameworks for risk reduction and crisis are put in place. We year in, year out, we wail, or we are affected by drought and floods in northeast Syria there. But if we are to pose a question to say, do we have an existing drought strategy framework as a region? We know that drought is now a common phenomenon in northeast Syria. But if we are to pose a question to say, within our food security and livelihood cluster system, within our agriculture working group, within our livestock working group systems, within our Department of Agriculture under the self-administration, do we have a disaster risk management framework in place so that farmers and communities are pre-positioned when it comes to address the negative impacts of drought and flood? If such frameworks or if such strategies are not in place, then we are simply saying there is need now to ensure that such frameworks are put in place. There is need for these agricultural policies to incorporate disaster risk management as the mainstream part of any sustainable agricultural development agenda. Why do we need such frameworks? These are very vital and important because they will be also like derived or also guide communities or farmers in relation for them to actually implement community-based natural resource management. Secondly, there is also need to ensure that we watch and safeguard. We watch and safeguard. You will find that I might also pose a question to say, do we have regular information in relation to early warning systems in regards to these emerging threats or disasters which jeopardize sustainable agricultural practice? I think on this one, I'm able to say we do have some reports, I think, from FAO on a few sets sharing, I think, early warning reports in regards to emerging threats and disasters. But I'm not so sure whether we do have a disaster risk management strategy framework or strategy document, or even a drought cycle management for Northeast Syria. Do we have it in place? Might be a question. Anyway, if not, it could also be a challenge which we can also pose to these various working groups for Northeast Syria, as we are also going to be engaged in them in future platforms or meetings. But you find that the good thing, yes, in terms of watching and safeguarding, or in terms of having some early warning systems in place, already in certain countries, we do have some integrated food security based classification system. But in the case of Syria, this is the equivalent of our commonly HNO, remember the humanitarian needs overview, which we normally do IMEP in partnership with the whole of Syria cluster, as well as the hub-based clusters and their respective partners. And again, it's another form of an early warning system, because out of this, the HNOs, as well as the FSLA, remember the Food Security and Livelihood Assessment, summary reports, fact sheets, and dashboards. Already they give these early warnings in regards to areas where they have got high concentration or high populations of people in need and so forth. But again, such reports also misses when it comes to some natural disasters or many disasters. For example, like extreme weather events in the form of floods and droughts. Normally, there's a tendency to mainly focus on food insecurity and vulnerability. Food insecurity. There's less involvement or less inclusion of vulnerability, which is related to natural disasters or which is related to mismanagement of natural resources. So this could be like the takeaway points where we also need to inform our cluster system to say, why can't we have like a disaster risk management strategies or frameworks in place for our region so that we can just activate these action points within these strategies, or we can also activate these pathways within these strategy documents wherever we face these disasters in future. Then the third one, we also need to apply risk and vulnerability reduction measures, even at household or at the community level. What we mean here, there is need to ensure that natural resources are well managed at community level. Then there is also need for livelihood diversification. I think I explained earlier already what we mean by livelihood diversification. As we support farmers, let's support them in a way that they can diversify their livelihood activities in such a way that they can cushion any negative impacts which might be at their exposure. We also need to risk-proof our infrastructure as well as our plantations. So typical examples of activities which could be implemented in regards to applying the risk and vulnerability reduction measures could be reforestation. You would find that in as much as we support farmers in Northeast Syria, both for crops and livestock, we are not doing much when it comes to reforestation. Remember, we said agroforestry is also one of the elements of sustainable agriculture. Despite that, we do have a desert-like vegetation type in Northeast Syria. A little is being done when it comes to reforestation. Yes, we know that people need agricultural land for agricultural production to produce food crops and so forth. But when it comes to projects like reforestation, this project could actually target geographical locations which are dominated by, say, rivers and streams, where people are actually supported in a way that they can plant more trees along river banks or along stream banks. This can also be done in the form of cash for work projects. So many times we think of cash for work projects solely maybe on the rehabilitation, maybe also on the sanitation when it comes to maybe rubble, creolate or so forth. You can also design cash for work projects where people are supported through a cash for work project where a humanitarian partner can actually buy some seedlings, tree seedlings, even natural plant species which are adapted to local climate and soil type. And then you distribute these seedlings so that people can actually plant them along stream banks as well as river banks. In a way, you would actually protect these water systems because the root systems of these trees, once they establish, they are also safe to combat soil erosion, to avoid soil deposition into water system. That's in a way you are actually managing these water resources. And then you can also think of rangelands restoration. I remember at some point when I was working in Kenya, we had a project where we were actually targeting what we call veld reinforcement, rangeland restoration, open grazing lands. we would actually have seed for fodder crops or fodder plants distributed among livestock herders who move around just throwing these seeds during the rain season to ensure that you improve the seed bank for fodder plants within your natural grazing land. In other developed countries, they even hire helicopters. I remember in Kenya again, another project had even to hire a helicopter to distribute to actually spread the seeds for fodder plants in the wilderness. You can imagine, say, you do have some communal grazing land. Then the helicopter will move around, actually spreading seeds haphazardly, so that upon come rainy season, the same seeds will start to germinate on their own. Upon germinating, of course, grazing can be also managed and controlled to ensure that the same fodder plants are not completely grazed before shedding their own seeds as well, to ensure that the seed bank within the soil system is enriched. You see, so it is very important to not just to focus on a livestock farmer, just looking at him and the animal. You might also need to expand project design for livestock support well outside the focus of the farmer and the animals per se. But you also need to consider the rangelands, the grazing land. Even if it happens to be a communal land, there are so many ways to also ensure that rangelands are restored. Okay, then again, we can talk of integrated livestock management. I don't need to overemphasize this. This is a situation where you can actually link livestock value chain linked to crop value chain. Remember that example of manure from livestock to improve soil fertility for crop production. Then upon harvesting, you also take crop residue to feed the same livestock so that they can feed and produce more manure, which also goes back to the livestock. So this is an integrated livestock crop or value chain system. Then again, we can talk of integrated pest and disease management there. I think we touched on this earlier on. Then there's also an aspect of rainwater harvesting. All these are responses to an attempt to apply risk and vulnerability reduction measures so that you reduce farmers' vulnerability and ensure that farmers can actually produce crops and livestock in a sustainable way. And then there's also need to be prepared and able to respond. You find that as northeast Syria, you are a region where you are naturally affected by disasters in the form of droughts and floods sometimes. So there is also need to ensure that the local authority, farmer associations, and even the FSL cluster, agricultural working groups, and livestock working groups, they also support farmers so that they are organized in such a way that they are prepared and able to respond when these disasters strike. Again, you may need to ensure that the project designs, where possible, they can also need to include aspects of seed reserves, storage facilities, livestock shelters. So many times we just think of livestock when it comes to fodder and vaccination, but sometimes we forget that during the crisis, livestock shelters can also be affected, and there may also be need for rehabilitation of these shelters. Then mitigation and preparedness, best practice guidelines for conflict, droughts, floods, landslides, transboundary plant and animal pest and disease control. So the question is, we may need to have all these guidelines in place. For example, do we have a drought and flood best practice management guideline in place? Do our farmers really know what to do during a dry cycle? Do our farmers really, because for instance, I can give you an example. Out of the floods, we can capitalize the negative impact of floods by to turn it into an opportunity. Out of these floods, I remember in South Sudan, when I was working there with Oxfam, South Sudan, because of River Nile, is one area where farmers actually face challenges in relation to high frequency of floods. But we ended up designing projects in such a way that farmers started developing what we call edge dams, small edge dams, to actually harvest flood water, which they would actually use to prolong their irrigation systems well into the drier season by actually harvesting flood water and so forth. So once upon this flooding water is harvested, again, it also reduces the flood events negatively impacting some other livelihoods. You see, so you could actually control floods by harvesting this water as well, maybe in the form of small earth dams, so that the same water can be used for irrigation and so forth. This is one typical example of flood water management. Then again, you find that with the crisis, there's a tendency for transboundary plant and animal movements as people move to seek safer areas as IDP. We may need also to have a transboundary livestock and pest and disease control management strategy in place to ensure that animals are managed as they move to reduce pest and disease infections to actually spill into an outbreak within the host community, as it would be receiving IDPs and their animals, or vice versa. So in response to natural disasters like droughts, floods, wildfires, which are very common in northeast Syria, humanitarian partners may need to collaborate and synergize to apply all the 4 pillars of the pro-resilience agenda, which we have since discussed. You would find that one particular project might not be able to address all the 4 pillars which we have discussed. But you find that if humanitarian partners collaborate or synergize, it will be possible to say within a particular community, all the 4 pillars of the pro-resilience agenda could be addressed. What we mean here is that instead of having all humanitarian partners distributing seeds to farmers, you might say maybe 1 or 2, or maybe the majority. Let's say you are in a particular community, you are in Amuda. I always like Amuda because I stayed there for some time. Maybe you are in Amuda. You might say, okay, within the FSL cluster partners, within the agriculture working group, maybe 70% of the humanitarian partners actually support farmers in regards to agricultural inputs. Then maybe 30% of them also focus on natural resource management. You see, rather than having all 100% just focusing on the farmer and his crops, and none of the humanitarian partners is supporting farmers towards natural resource management. I think, and again, we need to ensure that farmer support is integrated with capacity building. That's why we are actually doing this sustainable agriculture, climate smart agriculture training with you, so that you can also cascade these trainings to the farmers themselves. I think I also need to pause here for a question to say, is there any participant here who is coming from any humanitarian organization which is actually implementing a natural resource management project per se? And if there's anyone, I would want that particular participant to at least share the experience regarding to natural resource management projects being implemented anywhere in Northeast Syria.
سؤال كليتون هو إذا في حدا أي منكم شارك أو حاليا مشارك بمنظمته بمشروع ونشاطات لها دخل بإدارة الموارد الطبيعية Natural Resources Management. في أي حدا هون أو منظمته يمكن حاليا في عندها مشروع له دخل بهذا الموضوع؟
Either can text or just
تكتبوا على الشات أو تحكوا حكي. Can you give us examples of natural resources activities like?
For instance, we're talking about ensuring that the rivers, water resources are protected, ensuring that land is sustainably managed, and so forth.
أشياء لها دخل بإنه إدارة مثلا الموارد الطبيعية زي مثلا موارد المياه أو ممكن الأراضي الزراعية. هل في أي حدا اشتغل له دخل بهذا الموضوع؟ طلع raise his hand.
Okay, how can you tell us something?
I am sorry, Talal Ahmed, livelihood officer, Mercy Corps. We have rehabilitated 4 canals, irrigation canals, Raqqa sub-district, and cleaning irrigation drainage for 22 kilometers. That's all.
Okay, can you come again when it comes to cleaning? You said cleaning what? I did not get you.
No,
drainage مصارف أو يعني
هي قنوات مياه صح؟
قنوات مي وتنظيف ايش يسمونه المصرفانات او يعني هذا الصرف
الصحي.
هو صنف هذا خاص بالقنوات الري درينج.
Okay. So rehabilitation of water canals and cleaning the drainage of the water paths.
Water path. Okay, that's I will comment at once. Do we have any other example where humanitarian partners are actually supporting communities towards community-based natural resource management, say managing water resources, say managing land as a resource, and so forth?
لو بالعربي عادي ما في مشكلة إذا حدا حابب يشارك تجاربه أو تجربته.
Or even supporting communities towards the reforestation, planting of trees.
ممكن كمان اللي هو الكوميونيتيز نساعدهم بزراعة الأشجار وإعادة يعني زراعة مناطق اللي صار لها شو اسمه قطع للأشجار. طلال عندك كمان تعليق؟
I think we have sorry.
Come again?
we have community animal health workers activity. We have implemented Rakka. This activity include herders, and we contract with veterinary doctors to train them about how to breed the animals and healthy care. After that, those will provide their community. Each herder in his village, he will service his community in his village.
Okay.
Also, we have field farmer schools. We provide and support the farmers with technical information, agriculture technical information about the subject who they need to support them in it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your contribution. Now let me twist a bit my question. Here I had requested you guys to at least share any experience of any humanitarian partner which is supporting communities towards community-based natural resource management, things like maybe rangelands management, things like water resource management, things like soil and land management. But now, I'm now twisting to say, can you also share any experience in which your respective humanitarian organizations are supporting farmers in crop or livestock production? I think Tala already told us the irrigation rehabilitations, vaccination support in terms of livestock support and so forth. We would also want to hear from other colleagues who could also share what are they doing as humanitarian partners to support farmers in agriculture.
سؤال كليتن هلا بشكل عام ايش في اي نشاطات او بمنظماتكم عم تشتغل مع المزارعين بشكل عام، اي نشاطات زراعيه مش شرط فقط لها دخل بال إدارة الموارد الطبيعية. في أي حدا يقدر يعطينا إكزامبل بالعربي بالإنجليزي اللي بريحكم؟
We support the Seed Multiplication Foundation with the farmers who has contract with Seed Multiplication Foundation. We support them with cash for seed multiplication activity to buy fertilization for their crops.
Yeah.
Okay, that's seed multiplication.
Yes, I can translate this. نحن دعمنا I will talk in Arabic. نحن دعمنا المزارعين إكثار البذار اللي عندهم عقود مع مؤسسة إكثار البذار بالدعم النقدي. كان الدعم النقدي هو $300 لحتى يشتروا سماد لمحصول القمح تبعهم. يعني هذا نوع من بعتقد إدارة الموارد الطبيعية كدعم للبذار أو تحسين الوراثي، خلينا نقول، أو الدعم الوراثي للبذار.
He just translated what you just said.
We are also waiting for Osman Khalif there. I think he is texting. We'll see. Do we have any other participants who also wants to share on what their humanitarian organizations are doing to support farmers? We could see from Osman Khalaf there that which organization is this, Osman? They are supporting wheat farmers with seeds and fertilizers, support the small-scale breeders with fodder, supporting the vulnerable households with livestock distribution. This is restocking, livestock distribution, along with the agricultural service supporting Azolla hydroponic, barley hydroponic. This is contribution from Osman. Which organization is this one? Yes, along with some disaster risk reductions. Yes, that's NPA. NPA. That's Norwegian People's what?
NPA is
Norwegian People's Aid.
Yes, Norwegian People's Aid. Thank you, Vianney, there. Okay. You find that I did it purposely to say, yeah, some you could continue texting if you still want to contribute. I did it purposely to say, to ask you this question, to say, now that out of this training, we now all appreciate the importance of natural resources, be it water resources, be it land, be it underground water discharge, be it wetlands, be it forests, because of their with their biodiversity. We now appreciate that these natural resources are very important for sustainable agriculture. But the question is, when I asked to say, do we have any humanitarian partner which is supporting communities towards community-based natural resource management? It will not be surprising to say we might not have, maybe one or two. The majority of humanitarian partners or the majority of humanitarian work is solely centered and focused on crop and livestock production, missing out the need to integrate crop and livestock production being integrated to community-based natural resource management. I don't know if you are getting me there. So generally, this missing link where even as humanitarian partners, we tend to focus more on supporting farmers solely on crop and livestock production. And we tend to ignore or less focus on natural resource management. But we are saying the same natural resource base drives the sustainability of agriculture. I don't know if you are getting it there. So, yes, we know that when it comes to priority, yes, crop and livestock production improvement becomes the very first priority. But this is in a short-term benefit. When we also want to focus on the long-term, the pro-resilience, sustainability, there is also need to ensure that as we support farmers directly to improve their crop and livestock production, we also need to ensure that farmers are also supported in a way to better manage their locally available natural resources. And sometimes you find that we may fail to actually provide this support of natural resource management in the form of hardware support. What do we mean by hardware? Hardware, this is a situation where we really support with the touchable resources or assets, say seeds, seed distribution. These are hardware. But we are saying we may fail to support communities with the hardware support of towards natural resource management, but we can at least ensure that the software support, that is the trainings and so forth, really need to ensure that we incorporate community-based natural resource management in our training, so that farmers are made aware on the need and the importance to conserve these natural resources. which are very detrimentally important when it comes to sustainable agriculture. I hope you are getting my point here to say, yes, in program designs, we may not be in a position to actually fund maybe these reforestation activities. We may not be easily get donors to fund maybe field reinforcement or rangeland reinforcement for people to actually spread seeds in the wilderness, fodder seeds in the wilderness to improve our communal grazing land. We might not have readily available donor funds in that regard, but we can easily readily access donor funds to train farmers on community-based natural resource management. So even in our program designs, as we design our projects, we really need to ensure that within our training component, farmer training component, as we develop project proposal, after these training sessions, we really need to ensure that we incorporate a component where farmers are trained on natural resource management. Because already we can note that there's this gap already in the system when it comes to natural resource management implementations. So this is my last slide. So out of this introductory session on the concept of sustainable agriculture, what could be your takeaway points? I'm summarizing my takeaway points in a few lines. That is to say, where possible, distributing fishing rods, where possible, distribute fishing rods. And fishing rods in this case are synonymous to agricultural inputs. So I'm saying where possible, distribute agricultural inputs, which are synonymous to like fishing rods, and train people on how best to catch fish and maintain the rivers. The rivers become the sustainable agricultural part of it, while we do less of fish distribution. Let me unpack this takeaway point for you. We will share these slides at the end of the training sessions so that they will also serve as your notes for your future reading, as well as for your own information as you cascade the same trainings to farmers. We are simply saying, where possible, as you distribute agricultural inputs to farmers, you also need to train them on how best they should utilize these inputs. And at the same time, they should be trained on how best to utilize these inputs, that's agricultural production. But at the same time, don't just focus on the farm level agricultural activities. You also need to ensure that the natural resource base is also conserved and preserved. Just like if we are to take an example of someone who is distributing fishing rods to fish folks, to people who survive through fishing. If you distribute the fishing rods, you also need to train the fishing people on how best should they do their fishing. And at the same time, you also need to train the same fishing people on how best to maintain and preserve and conserve the rivers so that they can continue fishing. But sometimes we just distribute the fishing rods. We train people on how to make a big catch of fish, and we forgot to train the same people on how to maintain and preserve the rivers. So what will happen by the end of the day is the degradation of the same rivers. Once the rivers are degraded, it means that the fish catch will be low, and then the fishing people will catch little fish, and then by the end of the day, the whole system is disrupted, and people will start starving. Again, coming back into the agricultural inputs scenario, we are very good at distributing agricultural inputs to farmers, and we train them on how to use inputs on their farms. But sometimes we forgot now to also train them on how best to take care of their surrounding natural resources so that their agricultural system remains sustainable in the long run. So we need to be cautious and very strategic as we design our projects. We need to strike a balance towards self-reliance and sustainability. Why? Because again, we need to be careful when we say, let us not distribute seeds as well, the fishing rods, to starving people. If you get into a camp of IDPs or refugees, then you start distributing seeds. You are missing the point. Start distributing inputs. The same people might be starving. They really need food to meet their immediate food requirements. So if you go there and just distribute seeds, they will die before they even harvest if they are to plant the seeds, because already they will be like starving. So you also need to strike a balance there. How you also need to say to distribute food as well as also distribute seeds, maybe for them to eat first, get the energy, and then after getting that energy from the food which you would have distributed, then they can now start planting the seeds, maybe on their low input gardens to produce vegetables, so that they can be in a position to harvest maybe 2-3 months down the line. So in as much as we emphasize the need to promote self-reliance and sustainability, you also need to be cautious and be strategic, as informed by community need assessments. So that, remember the backbone of sustainability, the LRRD, you need to link relief. Relief is emergence, and the emergence becomes like food assistance as well. So you need to link this food assistance with recovery. Recovery becomes livelihood activities. That's where we also include agricultural production projects, right? So you really need to link relief, which is emergency, which is food assistance. Once people are supported with a relief response, you should also link it to a recovery where you also support agricultural activities. But again, this needs to be informed by context analysis. In certain scenarios, definitely you may need not even to support people through a relief response. For example, right now, I know that most parts of northeast Syria, say in Derek and so forth, and other areas, they may not be ideal for emergency response. Some of the area where there's relatively stability in terms of the context, farmers could be directly supported with recovery agricultural projects per se, without they have already surpassed the stage of the need for relief support, emergency support. So of course, we are saying the localized context specific analysis will inform you whether to respond in a way where you need to link relief and recovery. That is emergency food assistance and agricultural production support. In other scenarios also, you may not even need to support farmers, people with the agricultural projects recovery. Think of maybe a camp setup, a refugee camp setup, where people might not even have access to land for them to produce crops. In such scenarios, it might need to be emergency response through and through. So I will share these slides so that they will serve as your own reading notes during your own time. I will also encourage you to also read widely beyond what I've presented. I know that the concept of sustainable agriculture is actually a broad thematic area, and I tried to introduce it to you so that it can serve as an introduction component of subsequent training session deliverables, which will come after this sometime in June, where we'll actually focus more on the Northeast Syria context specific and how best we should do support farmers towards a sustainable agriculture oriented goal. This takes me to the end of my presentation. I don't know if you have any questions or comments. This is now the opportunity to also share with me. Thank you. Maybe Dana, you can.
في حدا عنده أي سؤال أي استفسار أو حابب يعلق على إشي؟ هلا إحنا هون بنكون خلصنا أول اللي هو Principles of Sustainable Agriculture Training. لقائنا الجاي رح نكون عم نحكي عن framework of action for sustainable agriculture production اللي هو it's more about the framework is more about how to implement basically.
Yes.
إنه كيف نطبق ال principle of sustainable agriculture على أرض الواقع. وبعديها بعد هذا السيشن رح نرجع ناخذ السيشن الثاني اللي هو الماركت سيستمز ديفلوبمنت اللي اخذناه اول سيشن. نفس الشيء رح يكون ماركت سيستمز، هذا انا رح اعطيه ماركت سيستمز ديفلوبمنت ان براكتس اللي هو كيف نطبق الكونسبتس اللي ناقشناها بخصوص ماركت سيستمز ديفلوبمنت باول تريننج عملناه. فهذا ان شاء الله صراحه اكيد رح يبعث لكم ريمايندرز ويبعث لكم امتى رح يكونوا النكست تريننجز. بس بخصوص هذا التريننج تبع اللي غطيناه تبع عندكم اي سؤال عن امبارح او اليوم؟ تمام. إذا هيك شكرا كثير ويعطيكم الف عافيه. ما بعرف صلاح اذا حابب تحكي اي شيء.